how should we tackle that fragmentation? Do you think that's something that's going to resolve itself over time? Is that another role the PPF could play?
Yeah, so I think this was started to be talked about 2 or 3 years ago, when many of your listeners will probably recall the Titcomb report, which outlined how, for example, the PPF could potentially, or how government could think about the PPF playing a broader role and leveraging the PPF. And one of the recommendations from the Titcomb report in 2022, 2023 was to consider how the PPF could be used as a consolidator for smaller schemes. I think it's important to look more broadly as well, because the Titcomb report was talking about consolidation of corporate DB as just one way in which the government could think about leveraging the PPF expertise, but it also highlighted that government should be looking more broadly at the PPF and thinking about other ways to leverage the core competencies at the PPF. And for those of us that work at the PPF, it's fairly obvious to think about what our core competencies are, but perhaps it's worthwhile reminding listeners that the PPF has 3 key competencies. We take money in from our levy payers, as well as assets of schemes that come to the PPF, and we invest those monies in order to earn investment returns. And this is how we've managed to grow our reserves in order to get to the financial position we are today. So we have a core competency in investing money. We then clearly need to pay out benefits. We have a core competency in administering pensions. And as many of your listeners will be aware, that is a thankless task and often, lowly rewarded task and fraught with complexity. It's something that we pride ourselves on, and we do rather well. And I think the third core competency, which many listeners may not immediately think of, is ensuring sufficiency of reserves. So that core competency is about understanding what sort of risks we are holding reserves for. In our case, it's future claims risks from the DB universe, but much like an insurance company or an annuitant provider, we also need to ensure that we have sufficient reserves to protect or to provide for future pensions, which are subject to longevity risk, for expenses, and all of the things that goes with running an annuity portfolio, and we have a roughly £17 billion annuity portfolio. So those are 3 things the PPF has excelled at, and the Titcomb report was really highlighting the fact that the PPF's expertise and skills in those 3 key areas could be leveraged, because as we go through time, the fact that we have a DB system that's diminishing, and it's right for government to think about consolidation in DC space, in the LGPS space, but increasingly it's important for government to also think about how consolidation might play out in the DB industry. Now, the final point I'd mention on this is just that fragmentation point, Charlotte, and perhaps I should have started there, but it might surprise some of your listeners to hear that about 2,250 schemes, or 45% of schemes by number of the 5,000 out there, are actually have less than £30 million in assets each. And that the total assets across those 2,250 schemes is only roughly 21 or 22 billion pounds, and they have liabilities of 25 billion pounds. In fact, if you drill a bit deeper and you look at schemes that were less than £5 million each, there's about 800 of them, and about half of them are in deficit. And the total AUM across those 800 schemes is only £2 billion. So we're talking about a very, very long tail. And I believe that all solutions should be on the table in terms of an end game strategy. For some of those schemes, a buyout or buy-in solution through an insurance company will be the right solution. And for others, who cannot get to a buyout or buy-in solution for whatever reason, we need to consider how those schemes could run on in a cost-effective way, and again, a consolidator, which the PPF, could participate in, is something which would allow that to happen.
I'm smiling and laughing here because I think this is a very eloquent and good sales pitch for why the PPF should be a consolidator, Charlotte. I think you deserve to be in front of select committees. I think you're wasted on just the professional investment podcast. fact, I'm laughing so
Thank you,
much. I'm laughing so
Charlotte.
much. I've dislodged my headphones. Anyway, that's a great sales pitch. I hope everybody really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Certainly did. And maybe you never know, there might be some policymakers watching this podcast
Up
too.
to pension schemes, because I mean, the investment analyst to me is loving all of this talk of down and dirty in the asset classes. But if we go back up to sort of like the pension schemes, what does it mean what are you saying for how they approach this? Because from what you're saying to me there, it sounds to me like you are sort of presenting an activist approach, that you're saying an asset class as an asset class is neither good nor bad. It's like a curate's eggs, there are good parts and there are bad parts, if that's the expression. I can't remember curate's egg mean now, but you're saying that sure, there's great private equity, sure, there's great private credit, but you have to know what you're investing in. So is it an activist approach that you're saying that pension schemes should adopt, or is it something more than that?
I think you're spot on. I think whether it's private assets, frankly, whether it's public equities or public fixed income, real estate or otherwise, there are real areas of potential bubble and expensive concerned areas versus those where there's kind of tons of opportunity. And I think the macro regime we're in is only going to create further distance between winners and losers. Mm-hmm. And so I believe that we are well past a market regime where you were thinking in these asset class buckets of, well, what is my equity fixed income or my equity credit liquid public-private mix, and I hold that over the long run and then outsource that to asset managers, what was called strategic asset allocation. And I think it's kind of not surprising you're starting to see a lot of movement away from that towards something that is kind of being called total portfolio approach, TPA, but really is how great multi-asset portfolios manage money. They're not just playing with these very rudimentary building blocks. They're thinking about the underlying regions and geographies and sectors, and really thinking about how those sit across the risk of the total portfolio, not just delegated to different specialists that aren't aligned and aren't looking at the bigger picture. And funnily enough, actually, just this last month, we've seen quite a lot of research and case studies being shown by Kaya and the Thinking Ahead Institute around translating TPA into practice. Like, what are the steps? What are the challenges? What are the case studies they're seeing from asset owners doing this? So it is a different mindset and approach that's needed.
Expanding broader, what about moving towards emerging market debt, or even frontier markets? And also thinking about the sustainability commitments that you have. Because I think something that was written about in Moral Money recently, it's insurers are right at the heart of the financial sustainability conundrum, because a lot of your business is insuring general insurance for flood, hurricanes, fire, protection insurance. So you've got to get the risks on that bit right. But on the opposite side of the balance sheet, you've also got to invest in the right assets that are going to pay out if you have to pay a liability. So if you get the risks wrong on either side of the balance sheet, that can be really catastrophic for an insurance company, which is, I think, the combination of the nature of the business that you do makes you probably at the forefront assessing climate change risk. And that's reinforced by the fact that you then have to make sure the assets are in the right place, because there's no point in you investing in a company that happens to be flood to play out in somebody's flood insurance, if I could take that example. So how are you thinking about how you invest sustainability sort of beyond sort of fixed income for infrastructure? If we think about things like natural capital, because there are a lot of interesting things out there that don't necessarily sit within quite a constrained fixed income universe. What's the innovation that's happening around that?
Fantastic questions, and there's loads of different dimensions to what you've just described. So the first thing to say is that we seek to be very progressive when it comes to the overall sustainability of our portfolio. So we have got, like many others, we have got net zero targets, which we are absolutely committed to. We're also, as a house, very focused on stewardship. So where the wider Legal & General firm has got votes where it is investing in equities, we take that role really, really seriously. So there's the bit about making sure that within the assets that we choose to invest in, we are progressive, sustainable, we've got minimum standards. There's then the point which I think is more interesting, which is how do we push the boundaries more? How do we make sure that we continue to open new markets? And so I gave the example of affordable housing previously. That was previously the remit of the not-for-profit sector. We created a for-profit venture so that we could build more affordable homes. But you also mentioned emerging markets. One of the challenges with emerging markets is that typically even the debt there can be sub-investment grade, which doesn't necessarily work for the UK regulatory regime. So we're looking at new innovative ways to tackle that market. We did an asset, or we invested in an asset earlier on this year with Togo, which was wrapped by the African Development Bank. I'm really passionate about that sort of investment where we work with another partner organisation to provide really good financing where it is needed, but also working within the UK regulatory regime. And so if you take that then a bit closer to home, and you mentioned natural capital, I think that's where we can make a really big difference, because at the moment natural capital is something that we would love to invest in, but because it's a very nascent investment class, then it doesn't fit that well with highly predictable cash flows that we need to be able to back our liabilities. So this is where partnering with other organisations to be able to create more fixed cash flows, I think, is really important, so that we can unlock what is undoubtedly a really critical sector and something where we ought to very naturally play.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a really valid point, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that in the current political environment. We've seen all the sort of joint action platforms really collapse, whether it's Climate Action 100 plus, or people are really, there's a massive, everything I hear from the institutional investment space is nobody's attitude towards sustainable investment has fundamentally changed. They just don't talk about it. So there's a massive amount of green hushing that goes on. And it's very difficult to campaign if you're silent. So I think that does hamper how effective a steward you can be. And I wonder if that doesn't maybe make you more interested in private assets where things can be done behind closed doors and written into agreements, and you can feel like you could be more effective than you can be on the public fronting side, and you can also be involved earlier on in the sustainability journey, whether it's about mitigating risk or finding new technology, that, you know, just be at that very early growth phase. Is that part of the appeal of private assets within the sustainable investment space?
Short answer is yes. So for anybody who doesn't want to listen to the rest of it, can turn off, right? I think
no, just
ultimately,
I have to always ask an open question that you can't answer with yes, so that's terrible.
No,
Give me more than that. You've made me an awful journalist.
but I think the really simple answer is ultimately yes, but the answers to it are so much more reasoned than that, right? Because I think if we take a step back, right, you're right, all the policy stuff, right, I get why we all work within boundaries, right? So you can see why people have to navigate it in special ways to try and survive this term, this chapter, right, and hope that there's something better at the end of it. And I'm a glass half full type person, and I think that environment we live in, that will evolve and will come out the other side, and the catalyst for it coming out the other side might be a change of personnel, change of policy direction, new technology. Maybe there's a disaster in the world that makes people step up and realise, right? So I think it's always hard to know what could be the catalyst for future change, but I believe that it will come eventually. As for private assets, right, so really, really high level, I think with private assets, you get access to technologies that actually have this positive externality change on the world, right? So I think there's a direct real world closer entanglement element. And then you answered it very cleverly for me, right? Which is you have ownership. So, you know, for the biggest companies in the world, you might have small percentage numbers of shares and you can vote on those, but if no one else agrees with you, they don't matter, right? You need to get to 50, 67% vote thresholds to make any meaningful change. Whereas with private assets, if you are at a minimum a large shareholder, if not the full owner of an asset, then what you do is you typically get a seat on the board of that private company, and you can sit there going, oh, this is what I think. Now, that's not to say just because you're sitting there that you can get everything that you want, but you have a much closer relationship to be able to go, have you thought about this? We care about that. That's fine, but can we get more data, or can we ask these? So there's an element there as well that you can influence more change. And I think as you then start breaking down that a little bit further, you then start realizing that increased traction also then gets you sometimes more industry engagement or sort of policy.
At the beginning of this conversation, you kind of teased us a little, Kinner, and you said that we'll be constantly innovating in investment. What are you thinking? Where's the innovation without like front running anything that you don't want to front run to our audience? What are the kind of things that you consider?
That's a very tricky question, and one that I'm going to respectfully pass on.
Yeah, but I am a journalist. I do have to ask, you see.
No, that does make sense.
To go back to maybe the private assets and the pepper farm, can you talk a bit more about, you talked about how you integrate your sustainability into those private assets. Maybe talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. And look, I'm going to give the spiel about the pepper farm because I absolutely love it, and I've tried the peppers from there, and it's great. But so for anyone that's listening that doesn't know, so there's a pepper farm which is by Bury St Edmunds, and it's actually the largest single block greenhouse in the UK. It's absolutely huge, covers about the same size as 20 football pitches. And, many of us know growing fruit and veg in the winter months in the UK is extremely, extremely challenging. And to grow fresh vegetables in this particular way actually requires copious amounts of fossil fuel. However, this investment that NatWest Cushion have made actually draws heat generated from a nearby wastewater plant. And by creating these new low carbon agricultural techniques in the UK, we actually take a step towards ensuring that we have reliable supplies for the future, and growing more of our food closer to home actually cuts down on food miles, including the carbon associated with transporting food products, which normally would happen. So, it's a great way that sustainability is sort of weaved into an asset class that is geared to provide high levels of expected return and that risk management that I was talking about earlier. And, there are a lot of examples and stuff that we invest in, like whether that's affordable housing, for example, different solar farms or wind farms. And for me, private markets is not just about the pure investment side. I think it has a much more deeper or multifaceted role to play in DC pensions. And I think the other part of that puzzle is engagement. I mean, things such as, very technical terms, investment jargon, if you will, that the average member doesn't understand, when they see what they're invested in and it's something like a high yield bond and they're like, have no idea what that means. But when they see things such as like affordable housing, or they look outside their window and see communities that they live in are being developed, it's something that resonates with members more, and it's something that will sort of lead them to engage with more because it's something that they're actually interested in and something that's a bit more tangible and sort of more...
As the market gets bigger, and you talked about how pots are currently about £10,000 are going to get to £100,000. And another bit on the pension schemes bill is a government that's keen to sort of drive forward consolidation. As one of the largest master trusts currently in the UK, I think you have AUM of about 50 billion at the moment. Do you think about that consolidation bit higher than 50 billion? You can tell me the exact number so we have it correct on the podcast.
Yeah.
Do you think about what you need to do? What happens when you reach 100 billion, for example? Obviously, you're well over the 25 billion that the government requires. There's no need for you to buy anybody or merge anybody, which would be a bit odd given your unique circumstances. But how are you thinking about the future? Because what I've learned about running a small business is you need to think about the future now. Otherwise, you get completely caught out by stuff as it arrives.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I've been at Nest since inception, and the solutions for a scheme when you have a few million, or even if you've just got a few billion, from an investment perspective, are very, very different from when you get to 50 billion and as you move towards 100 billion. I think for us, what's been most instructive is looking at our kind of counterparts internationally. So if we look at the Canadian funds, They're huge, much bigger than any kind of UK pension schemes, and the same with the Australian super funds. So we spend lots of time talking to colleagues both from Canada and Australia, and continental Europe, and the Dutch pension schemes are really helpful as well. A lot of the changes that we're going to be going through from an investment perspective is making sure we're properly structured to manage all of that extra money, and a big part of that is sort of moving along the sort of investment chain. So when we first started out, the only way we could invest and kind of fulfill our sort of investment beliefs about diversification were to use kind of pool funds, where we're very much kind of buying off the shelf and then mixing them internally. As we got larger, we could move to segregated mandates. As we get bigger again, we can move to private markets. And our kind of next stage of kind of development is moving more into the co-investment space, and potential in the future that we may want to insource some elements of asset management. But to do that, the infrastructure that you need to have wrapped around your internal investment capability is much more complex, and then you start looking more like a fund manager. So that's the sort of journey we're going on. We don't have a kind of specific destination. We've seen some very big pension schemes still primarily use external managers for their allocation. But what we do see is the ability to kind of monitor and hold managers to account, the ability to attract the right kinds of people to those organizations as they get larger. It just becomes harder if you want to keep improving. And our approach has been, as we've got bigger, why wouldn't we offer our members more sophistication if we can do that at a similar cost? So I think scale is a huge advantage. There may be some points in the future where scale can be kind of problematic in terms of you just get too big to do some things. And we feel we're a long way away from that. And I think our big challenge is making sure that we have the infrastructure in place to manage 70 billion, 100 billion, and beyond.